Good morning, colleagues. Good morning. Good morning. How are you doing?
I'm not sure how well, but
Well,
I
it's
can
an
now hear you. That is a relief.
yes, it's an absolute pleasure for you to join with us this morning. Let me say good morning to folks who are joining. It turns out you're quite a popular man. We've had
Oh gosh.
this is a good thing. Yes, we've had a remarkable number of registrants. I actually didn't have an idea about how it was going again. So first, let me say thank you for agreeing. And by way of a bit of personal note, I'm in Seattle, so let me say good morning from Seattle, Washington.
Okay.
It turns out that the joint mathematics meetings are being held in Seattle, and so I have a few things to do as part of my broad work as a mathematician in this part of the world. So for those who have not been here before, let me say that I am Terrence Blackman, chair and associate professor of mathematics in the Department of Mathematics at Medgar Evers College in the City University of New York. Let me welcome you to the Transforming Guyana series, which is now, I think this is 2 years and 7 months on. So 12, 12, 24, and 7. So this is our 31st episode. You know, part of the reason that we're doing it is because, you know, we really want to impact those ideas that potentially can transform ideas, people, things that one wants to do to affect a transformation of Guyana in a way that we all think and hope that she will be transformed given this opportunity. And you know, as we started this 2025, we could think of no better person to kind of give us a sense of the lay of the land. And I want to welcome you, you know, broadly to help us kind of explore the opportunities and the challenges that shape Guyana's future. And, you know, the broad goal of what we're doing is to inform, to engage, and hopefully to inspire sort of actionable insights. And today we're very honored and to have the Honorable Carl B. Greenidge join us for the hour. And I think this is one of the things we wanted to do. We wanted to have an extended chat with you. You know, many of you know that Foreign Secretary Greenidge has been a distinguished leader with expertise in governance, diplomacy, and development. And I thought I'd take a moment, because it's always very important to say who folks are. I tend to think that, you know, of recent vintage, we've sought to we have not effectively valued expertise. And so if you will permit my indulgence, audience, to just read a few snippets from the bio to briefly introduce Carl Greenidge, highlighting, you know, his experience and contributions. So Carl B. Greenidge is an economist by training whose background has been in the area of economic analysis, planning tools and techniques, as well as economic policy. After graduation from the Universities of Exeter and London, he taught economics and undertook research at the Universities of Exeter and London on income, employment, and growth impacts of agricultural innovations in Kenya. He has retained an interest in economic policy and planning, and as Chief Planning Officer and Secretary to the State Planning Board in Guyana, during which he was assigned to the SPC of East Germany to observe their techniques of planning. He was subsequently appointed to several regional and international expert groups over the years and has published work in several areas of economics. After academia, Mr. Greenidge entered the arena of politics. As a senior minister of government, he has held portfolios of finance, economic planning and trade, and latterly as the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. He has served as acting PM of Guyana and carried out on several occasions the duties of the executive president of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. He's also distinguished himself in a career as a negotiator, as was, for example, the lead negotiator on behalf of the coalition of the 2015 Commingsburg Accord, which yielded only the second such formation in over 60 years of Guyana's post-independence history. He has success in leading negotiations on behalf of the ACP group of states in relation to the ACP-EU post-Lomé III and Cotonou successor agreements. And most recently, 2020 was one of the two ministers who negotiated on behalf of the Caribbean, the region's framework for Cotonou successor agreement. I think many of us today see the Guyana that we have, and we should be reminded that he led on behalf of Guyana the team which designed and successfully negotiated the economic recovery program, which was widely acknowledged to have restored Guyana's international financial standing and heralded until 2020 7 years of unprecedented economic growth. At the WTO, he has led the ACP technical team, which helped to defend the Latin America case against the EU and ACP, challenging the ACP-EU Banana Protocol and the WTO waiver for the Lomé Convention. At the International Court of Arbitration, he was the key witness in the International Chamber of Commerce case, which Green Construction Company brought against the government of Guyana and its agencies. In the ruling substantially won by the government of Guyana, Mr. Greenidge was singled out, specifically cited and commended for his explanations and role in clarifying for the hearing the key elements of the case. And I think most importantly, as the Guyana ICG agent and leader of the Guyana team during the course of the enhanced mediation negotiations overseen by the Secretary General of the United Nations and his personal representative, Ambassador Dag Nylander. These negotiations secured the referral of the Guyana-Venezuela Paris 1899 arbitral award to the International Court of Justice in 2018. Foreign Secretary Greenidge was also a member of the International Steering Committee on the Global Assessment of Agriculture, Science, and Technology for the Development, and subsequently contributed as an author and a reviewer editor to the 9-volume report on science and technology in agriculture. He served on several boards in Europe, and he was the deputy chairman and on 2 advisory committees of the University of Oxford. So VP Foreign Secretary Greenidge brings to us a wealth of experience. And I think as we kick off this crucial year for Guyana, I can think of no better person to have this conversation with. So having said that, I wanted to say welcome again and thank you. And in this context, having read the wealth of experience that you bring to the stage, I wanted to start off with asking you, how do you see, first, how do you see the oil and gas revenues being leveraged to create sustainable economic growth for Guyana? I think in light of your work, and this was where I thought in light of your work in the recovery plan, the ERP, I think perhaps I should start there, and then we will move forward. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Terence. If I may address you, Professor Black.
Absolutely.
for the kind words of introduction. This series that you've started on, I believe, is very important, and it is good that you've been able to attract so many viewers and participants. The economy of Guyana has struggled over the years as a result of a variety of factors, some of which are policy, caused by policy, and other factors that are the result of where we find ourselves in the world. You have control over some things, and some other things have control over you. The advantage of the discovery and exploitation of petroleum and oil for Guyana will lie in the immediate boost that exploitation gives to Guyana's revenue stream. This is the first and most important factor, and the most obvious one. The impact of oil compared to manganese, bauxite, and sugar in the past should not be underrated. I think a lot of Guyanese do perhaps fail to recognize that oil, because of the market and the revenues associated with it, is almost unique. Not that it's a unique product, it's just the market that we find ourselves in, where all the world's activities turn upon energy, oil. And in order to generate and distribute that energy, we have chosen, or we found ourselves in a situation of using petroleum. And because so much, therefore, moves on petroleum, the price of petroleum is very high. And relative to Guyana's output, the value of oil and gas is very high. So let me put it this way. I see some figures recently suggesting that between 2020 and 2023 alone, those years post 2020, the production of oil and gas in Guyana, it's primarily oil, increased by 425%. That is a testimony to the capacity of the companies that are working on the oil and gas fields. It has moved Guyana in 2020 from a position of per capita income below the average in the region and across the globe. It has moved us to a position in which Guyana's GDP is above average and rising rapidly. And that GDP at international prices has moved from roughly 5,000 US dollars per capita, that's international dollars per capita, to something like 35,000. It is a tremendous increase. And I think most people acknowledge that it is a rather startling increase, attributable in part to policy and without doubt to the capacity of the consortium of companies producing petroleum in Guyana. And the immediate consequence of that kind of revenue increase is that we are in a position to deal with some of the biggest problems we've had over the years, ranging from, and those of you that are young enough to recall the difficulties of the early 21st century, public sector revenue inadequate, per capita incomes inadequate to meet cost of living needs. None of this has been eliminated, but the flow of revenues from petroleum can, properly managed, make a significant impact on those indicators. So issues such as indebtedness, we were one of the world's most seriously indebted countries, can be addressed. Issues such as the state of our net international reserves can be addressed. We had such inadequate international reserves that from month to month, we were challenged to be able to find the resources with which to import the goods and services we needed to keep Guyana rolling from day to day. Production levels outside of petroleum also mattered. We are a major producer of well, we are a producer of primary products, ranging from manganese to sugar, to balata, things that are more obscure perhaps. And we find ourselves in a situation where infrastructure, roads, rivers, air transport, um, and industrial infrastructure in particular are grossly inadequate. The increase in the road mileage, the mileage of paved first-class roads in Guyana, has not moved in accordance with those figures that I mentioned as regards per capita income. If our road mileage could have increased by anything like even the 25%, let alone 425%, this will be a transformed police. So I hope that will give your audience, Terence, an idea of what the revenues need to be channeled to. We have problems of potable water, intestinal problems and illnesses are a major problem in Guyana. Environmental illnesses are a major problem. So health is an issue, as it is in most developing countries. To the extent that you have financial resources, you can now address those physical manifestations of underdevelopment. And this clearly is one of the major priorities of the government at the moment. But what I want to go on to say is there is also the need to recognize that your capacity to actually enhance these material indicators and resources will depend upon other things as well. Training, the management and encouragement of human resources. We have, I think, distinguished ourselves, not in a flattering way, together with other countries, and I mentioned Jamaica not to be rude in any sense, derogatory in any sense, but to say that amongst the countries of the world, these two are amongst those who lose the highest proportion of trained manpower. You cannot have long-term growth if you continue to perpetually lose trained manpower and expect that you are going to be able to make it up by foreigners, especially by foreigners from outside of your region who are not accustomed to cultural and other practices. So it is a challenge, it remains a challenge today. And if you look at the controversies and complaints in the press, you will see this constitutes one of the problems. So whether it is doctors who are leaving, professors of mathematics who are leaving, professors of sociology, I see a political scientist appearing on the screen. Um, it is important to understand that it's no use building roads and stellings if the human resources to manage those and also to inform your populace are being lost. So I make those points by way of, if you like, opening comments, because that needs to be understood. It's no point in building schools and hospitals if you don't have students who stay, if students leave as soon as they graduate, if lecturers don't stay because they're dissatisfied with incomes, some of them even leaving to neighboring countries, which they may feel are perhaps better managed, even though their monies may not be as generous as ours. So all of those have to be taken into account when you are putting together a program. And in this particular case, income enables you to be more attractive to partners in international economic cooperation and international trade. Recently, one of our ministers mentioned about an indebtedness to the indebtedness of the Dominican Republic to Guyana, and seemed to suggest that the willingness of that country to pay debts that been owing to us for more than 10 years arose from maybe the handsomeness of ministers or the elegance with which they address. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the extent to which there's international confidence in this country and that it will grow, it will continue to grow, and the facilities upon which fruitful cooperation can be based will be in place if they're not already there. So that is, I'm sorry to have taken so long,
No,
but
no, no. I think you've raised a question which is already sort of bubbling up in the context. And you know, I think as you've sketched out, you've been building, so really leveraging this moment to build national wealth. And so one question which, given your work in agriculture, how do you see this question of diversification of the economy? We've seen a lot of, every day we see sort of, we're diversifying, but it's the sense of a robust economic diversification program, so that we don't end up where 95% of Guyana is based on a volatile commodity, and we make large plans, and then tomorrow we haven't really planned effectively to diversify. How do you see that aspect?
Thanks, Terence. This is a very, very important issue for two reasons. One is that you, as an economy, Guyana as an economy, at this point in time, in 2025, January 2025, depends inordinately upon the production and export of petroleum. Down the road, it is going to get worse because you will add the production of gas to that. And if you are heavily dependent on one commodity, producing one commodity, that poses one set of problems for you in the event that the markets go up and down, the domestic market and external market. But it poses additional problems as regards exports. So you depend upon export markets. So it isn't only it is primarily a question of seeking economic balance, structural balance. You want an economy that is so structurally balanced that if a single market had a hiccup, you don't get a complete upset stomach, if we might use this sort of biological analogy. So this is the challenge we face, that you are heavily dependent on oil, inordinately so. You have also to ensure that in the years going forward, as you use the revenues to do some of the other things I've mentioned, you also diversify the structure of the economy so that if the price of lubricants or simply the price of petroleum falls by 30 or 40%, which is not unheard of, it moves from where it is to $5 a barrel or $8 a barrel in terms of crude, you are not going to collapse as an economy, as has happened to many.
Yes. And in that respect.
Sorry, one little point. I emphasize that to say that the diversification to which you refer must not be seen by persons only pertaining to agriculture. It starts right in the petroleum sector, because if that is your major source of income and it encounters a major hiccup and you're not diversified, all the rest of the system is going to go to sea. So you are right in pointing to agriculture, because agriculture, everybody has to buy food. The markets for agriculture are such that you cannot depend upon the rest of the world to deliver. And indeed today, we've seen countries using food as a weapon of war. And we are not without enemies. So one of the things that we have to do, diversify in relation to petroleum and also diversify in agriculture. And if I might map a little bit, the diversification must be such as, again, borrowing a little bit from the work of the new school of economists out of the Caribbean, and made famous by Clive Thomas, that you are producing things that you can consume, not only that you can export, but things that you can consume, and consuming things that you produce. In that way, you have a circle of production and consumption that are complementary, consistent one with another. That's the sense in which diversification is important, and the sense in which agriculture is important, because by diversifying the agricultural sector, you are in a position actually to bring as part of the gainers from this exercise the poorest members of the community. Lowest incomes in this country are associated with agriculture and rural uh,
Activity.
habitation. I
Yeah.
was going to say employment. It's not. Sometimes they are unemployed or underemployed in the agricultural sector, as is also in some of the inner urban areas. So that is important to marry with these higher levels of income, the activation of production, new technologies that will enable better productivity in agriculture, because this is one of the big problems there. To the extent that you have these sorts of incomes that we've spoken about in relation to petroleum, then you can pay early attention to enhancing agricultural productivity, forestry productivity, the productivity of those fisher persons who are working on the rivers and seas. It isn't only about oil. It isn't only about oil.
Yeah, and actually, that's a very important point that you make. So it isn't only about oil, and part of what somehow you want to leverage oil is to be able to, have things that you produce, you consume, that there's a virtuous circle.
Right, right.
But in that context, I wanted, because I think this is also one other thought I wanted to get your thoughts on this infrastructure investment that you mentioned. Sort of, one of from afar, one of the things that folks say, you constantly see the
New roads and new
the
buildings.
new roads and so on. But on the flip side, what you see is that they're not somehow. You don't get the sense that there are lots of complaints, so to speak, of the quality of the roads, etc. And so what I wanted to kind of have you reflect on is this sense of even as you drive this infrastructure, some of your thoughts on how you drive this infrastructure so that it meets the criteria that you've sort of laid out
Yeah.
as this virtuous circle. How does
Well,
it?
yeah, you are very right. This is one of the main focuses of local complaints. The idea of enhancing infrastructure is not that the infrastructure in its own right is something you can eat. It's not something that makes you uh, better health-wise, although it can do. But that it's not sufficient just to have the physical facility in place. But at least the physical facility you put in place must be of such a quality that it improves, whether it is the time taken to travel from Buxton to the airport, or the time taken to travel from New Amsterdam to Crabwood Creek. And the points that you raise about quality affect us greatly, because you have had situations. We've had situations in the past where these bank road, having been built, and in this case by a regional firm, uh, in circumstances that most people regard as questionable, built the road, and it had to be rebuilt 4 or 5 times within 4 or 5 years. This is unacceptable. It is a waste of resources. So one of the things that has to happen in undertaking the infrastructural uh, enhancement in Guyana is that the rules of quality, which means that procurement arrangements have to be very tight. In fact, I would say that the more money you have to spend, the more careful you have to be about how that money is spent, because people are going to become disillusioned about what the money can do, and whether the benefits are getting to them quickly enough. And if that happens, you're going to be in trouble. As a government, it is important that people be not disenchanted about that. But there's another point, apart from quality, and quality has to do also with governance and the arrangements for governance, including procurement. You have in the old planning methods and methodology, which as you mentioned, one would have acquired in looking elsewhere, whether it is Kenya, Germany, and so forth. And these are amongst the best examples in the developed and the developing world. The use of certain techniques. What is, for example, in deciding upon the next infrastructural project, you need to be informed by a criterion that is relevant. In the old days, when I first started, there was a term which is associated with some of the old planners in the time of Arthur Lewis. There was a term of bottleneck breaking. In other words, you look around, you see how the economy is working, you see where the bottlenecks in terms of time wasting, the movement of products, the costliness of products, you see where those problems are arising, and you apply the investments to those points, whether it is in terms of telecoms or roads, hospitals, but there is a logic to it, what is called bottleneck breaking. Now, that's a qualitative decision in a sense, but you can also use what in the first plan fashioned in Guyana between Arthur Lewis on the one hand and Lloyd Best, the use of incremental capital output ratios. In other words, if you're going to put $1 on a piece of investment and you are faced with 10 options, you choose that investment which will give you higher returns to the dollar. You don't choose because you like it. You don't choose because it looks glamorous. You don't choose because it impresses your neighbor. You choose one that is going to yield you income returns, either in terms of cash or in terms of time spent. And we often, as Caribbean people, don't value time perhaps well enough. And therefore, this is a handicap we started off with. But right now, this, in relation to the investment projects you speak about, is absolutely necessary. Better and tighter criteria be used, not only for awarding projects, but for deciding on the priorities. Right. It's very important.
You know, as you go on, and so what's kind of emerging, and that's been bubbling up in the chat too, is these sort of questions of, broadly transparency and accountability, broadly sort of governance, and I don't want to, but this has come up in the press in other places. We've had these emanations around the National Resource Fund 2019, National Resource Fund 2021. I don't want to reflect on the specific political aspects of Guyana, but just to kind of broadly on the question of sort of governance and policy and transparency and accountability. What do you see as things that ought to be in place? Folks are writing in and wondering, is it constitutional reform? Is it about how the list is done? I mean, just reflect broadly from your perspective, having seen this thing evolve over an extended period of time. What are the learnings for the future as we think about governance and transparency, and about how our governance process can be empowered to help us to effectively leverage these resources?
Those governance issues you raise are very important, and naturally, because they are so contentious in Guyana, one has a tendency to say, well, let us talk about that on another occasion,
Well, I mean,
or,
I,
or something like that.
you
So
said,
I'm not going to go there.
yeah,
I'm simply wanting to say to you that one can understand the political sensitivities associated with discussions of governance, the qualities of governance, and decision making. But what you are faced with here, if you see it on the one hand, a firm and a way the way the managing directors or CEO run a firm obviously will have consequences for the profitability and the efficiency of the firm. And the same thing applies in governance. And that is why I, I have made reference to what some people may regard as trying to bring in unnecessarily technical issues into a discussion that is meant to be a more general discussion. We speak of incremental capital output ratios. These are criteria accepted internationally and reflected in Guyana's first plans uh, that allow you to make decisions on an objective basis rather than making decisions off the top of one's head or based upon the predilections and idiosyncrasies of political leaders. So more attention needs to be paid to criteria such as these, which will protect the leaders themselves from criticism. We seem perhaps sometimes to be worried or unwilling to accept that, yes, the public is not a technical public which will know everything about economic issues, but at least they must understand the general thrust. The priorities that you choose must be understandable. Yes, priorities about infrastructure are understandable, but even in choosing infrastructure, there are decisions to be made about whether to replicate some that has already been produced or to diversify further and what have you. There are rules that can help one in this. And insofar as they aren't sufficiently specific, an administration or a political decision maker may help himself and his administration by making it clear to the public that there is a plan somewhere, there's a program somewhere, clearly thought out, which is available for them to look at. And then it has a logic that they can understand and embrace. That
yeah,
is one of the things missing in Guyana.
yeah. I like the way you framed that. There is a plan somewhere that is clearly thought out, that has a logic that can be looked at and embraced by the broader populace, that informs the sort of developmental
And they must be
strategy.
able to see it. Yeah.
And you want to be able to see it, it's amazing. Every time I talk with you, I feel like the time just kind of runs away. I'm looking and I'm realizing that we're already pushing close to the hour, and I haven't said
Oh,
anything
God.
at all about the. So maybe I'll use this as a sort of tweak. So I noted a few days ago, someone sent me a note that President Maduro has said that very shortly there will be a governor for Guyana Essequibo, and so I want to frame this in the context of what you've been just discussing. Give us an update on the current. I know it's too long, but just kind of where are we today? Many of us noted the completion of a bridge in Ankoko, and a sense of, to the point you just made, of how is this dispute, well, not dispute, but controversy, informing our developmental strategy?
Well, the developmental strategy has to be informed by these factors of risk, where resources are to be invested and what arrangements are to be made for their protection. Unfortunately, Guyana, by its own actions internally, cannot uh, ensure its own protection, physically or militarily. let me say as regards the basic process. The basic process as we saw it in 2015 was the first step involved making the United Nations aware that we were not happy with the process of good offices, because this was being abused by Venezuela, and therefore for them to direct the matter to a forum where a definitive decision could be taken. This was done by the negotiating team that worked on Guyana's behalf, and that negotiation team found that at the end of 2017, the United Nations Secretary General and his team, together with Doug Newlander, accepted that dialogue between Guyana and Venezuela alone were not solving the problem. In fact, they were growing wider apart, and therefore the matter should be referred to the ICJ. It was referred to the ICJ. We lodged a complaint with the ICJ, and the ICJ is supposed to be looking at the substance of the issue, which is whether the 1899 award was valid or not. There's no other issue. A whole set of other issues are being raised by Venezuela, and they sought to raise in Argyle and by some of our Caribbean colleagues. The issue has nothing to do with whether Guyana is a good friend of the United States, too good a friend of the United States, not close enough to Mr. Maduro. It is about a country fabricating the circumstances leading to a decision taken in 1899, denying that they had agreed to that decision. And the court has so far, for example, confirmed that the matter was referred to the court and that the court has the power to examine the matter, and this is in the competence of the court. Now you have the substantive matter. On the way to the court deciding on the substantive matter before it, valid or not invalid, we had a question of Venezuela's posing a threat to Guyana, and that took a diversion. The court has looked at it and pronounced on it. Okay, these are the measures. The court has taken a decision that Venezuela is not to take action that will threaten the governance, if you like, of the Essequibo. And we now await two elements of a process. One is our response to Venezuela's counter memorial. A counter memorial has been presented to the court. It has a lot of inaccuracies and fabrications. Well, that's for the court to decide. But from our viewpoint, our response is that it has a lot of inaccuracies and complete and outrageous fabrications. So the court now will hear Venezuela's response to our refutation, and that is to be presented in August or by August of 2025. After that, the court may have a couple of questions to ask of the two parties, and then it will be in a position to make a decision. Now, in my view, and I'm sticking my neck out here, that process ought not to take us beyond 2026, if that far, because the major issues, the substantive issues, have already been put on the table. And therefore, short of Venezuela's generation of new diversions, the court ought to be in a position to make a decision. That is where that starts. But because of the risks associated with Venezuela's behavior, a behavior that suggests that notwithstanding an international body making a decision, we've seen this several times, they either deny that this decision was made or that it was properly made. We have to do diplomatic work to ensure that our partners in the region, whether it be CARICOM, Central America, Latin America, and the Caribbean, or the international community as a whole, as represented by the Security Council or United Nations General Assembly, we have to devote a lot of skills and money to making those foreign and countries aware of our plight and the dangers of a more powerful military partner seeking to engage us in a dialogue, which dialogue is merely aimed at overturning legitimate decisions that have been made in the past. Venezuela has been doing this since 1962. Call for dialogue. When you have dialogue with them, the dialogue is accompanied by military force. And we saw this a year to the date. Yeah, I
Or
saw.
Secretary Greenidge, I wanted to. I just had a thought, which is kind of, as I listen to you, saying, Venezuela has been doing this since
Yeah.
since the early 1960s, and there is a sense in which we've gone for almost a half of a century with this process. I want to ask, this is kind of just an off the beat question. How do you feel? Because it seems to me that, do we have young people graduating or high school graduating University of Guyana who will be able to kind of carry this fight forward so that they're informed intellectually, they understand the issues, they understand the history? How, do we have a a Guyana-Venezuela working group that is primarily as part of our national security infrastructure that is just focused on this issue in a sense because of its existential nature? I know that came out of left field, but I just thought, how well are we preparing? How many people understand the history?
It is a genuine question. First of all, let me say that there are skills, whether they are within Guyana at this point in time, and those within Guyana at this point in time will remain in Guyana in 2 years' time, is a question I cannot answer. But unless you can do that, unless you can hold those skills that you have and have a net increase in the skills available to you, you are going to be challenged to deal with the machinations of our neighbor or neighbors. And Guyana has to devise more explicit policies at the level of government, in government, that is the administration itself, as well as in Guyana. And when I say, you need people in the public sector, you need people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and so forth. That's obvious. That's what I'm talking about. But you also need people out there in the private sector, in non-governmental organizations who will stay in Guyana. And as you can see, has happened in the Ukraine, a lot of their effort has been supplemented at the military front and the diplomatic front by private sector skills. And we have to understand that. If you discourage people by politicking, is the source of a lot of alienation of Guyanese. A lot of Guyanese leave this country due to the politics. Whether you blame one party or the other, to me, is irrelevant. Together, they contribute to that problem. And unless that is fixed, you're not going to have the people when and where you need them. There's no reason why we cannot generate the skills we need, but you cannot afford to bleed, suffer the loss of skills that we currently suffer and survive. So the point you're raising has it is something I wish I could devote my attention to. When I was teaching, there was an opportunity to encourage students to take up things that are relevant to us. But it isn't so easy now, and a number of policies need to be looked at to mobilize and bring those skills closer to us.
To that extent, you speak to kind of human capital development.
Yes.
Just more broadly, how do you see education, workforce development, in the context of our Guyana of 2025?
Education, as you look at it now, is absolutely critical. I was mentioning Guyana's dubious distinction with Jamaica of losing their educated human resources. You need, it is a high priority to utilize and develop infrastructure. You need those skills to ensure that you have engineers coming off the the line at UG, to ensure that UG's output is widened, to ensure that you can take advantage of the UWI and North American universities. You need to do more at the University of Guyana. You need to do more at primary and secondary schools. You need to lower the dropout rates in some of our inner city areas, and it is high and unacceptably high. I know I run the risk of being criticized and attacked by the government for this, but there is a loss of skill in a place that we can't afford that loss of skills. It's not only qualified doctors that you suffer from when that affect you adversely when you lose them. Whether it is that people graduating at the technical institute and passing the exam today and leaving tomorrow, Georgetown Technical Institute, Myconi Technical Institute, New Amsterdam Tech, all of that leakage needs to be plugged, because to the extent that you have an exceedingly small population vis-a-vis your land area and vis-a-vis your oil resources, you're not going to be able to protect it unless you have those people and unless they're skilled and committed.
As you speak, so in a sense, I want to ask them, and I have no agenda here, but this has been one of the animating aspects of this program, was to think about ways in which the diaspora can play a role in this context. And I know that we've seen a long history of kind of the government sort of engagement with the diaspora, engage, not engage, looking for a plan, not looking for a plan. Now there's a kind of, so, what's your thought? I mean, if you had to do it, how do you think you should effectively engage this diaspora so that it can contribute to the national development that you're speaking on?
Well, the diaspora attraction, if you like, the engagement with the intention of attracting the diaspora skills has to be done at a number of different levels. Some members of your diaspora are obviously not going to leave where they are to join us. But you have to find a mechanism whereby you can utilize the skills and experience that they have. Sometimes it'll be moving them. Sometimes it'll be simply using the digital skills digital facilities that are available to us to have them look at problems and contribute to solutions. I think you have to be imaginative about this. There are some examples of how this is done in the medical field. Not much in education now, as far as I can remember, but in the medical field in particular, I suppose because of the commitment to enhancing the humanitarian status of Guyana, many medical doctors abroad, in North America in particular, have volunteered to come to Guyana physically and serve without an income that Guyana provides for 2 weeks, 2 months, and longer, some of them. You have to, in order to attract more of those and keep them, you have to ensure that the local facilities are adequate. I mean, if you are bringing kidney specialists and eye specialists and ontologists, you have to have the tools that they can work with. Some of them actually work with their own skills and bring friends who are not Guyanese at all, who may have never been here. This is a very impressive thing. More has to be done to bring them and to hold on to them and to encourage them to keep coming. We've had problems in the past where some of the locals have tried to discourage them in a variety of ways. I don't want to get into that, but we have arrangements that are bureaucratically unacceptable, whereby people who in normal circumstances would be able to work in Guyana are told, oh, when you must pay a fee, you've paid your fare to come to Guyana, you've ended up at the Georgetown Public Hospital or at Mbaimadai, and somebody suddenly says somewhere, you are not qualified to
practice medicine.
Practice in Guyana because you haven't paid $1 million somewhere. No, this is a no-brainer. The government itself should take on that task. The government should take on such a task and protect people from this type of harassment, let me say. And sometimes when you see what has happened, you have to treat it as harassment. So there are a number of areas like this. We have musicians. We have some composers who have written and composed and arranged music for some of the world's outstanding singers and musicians. And those skills
Yeah.
are not available in Guyana. We had a friend of mine who died not so long ago, well, perhaps a while ago, who was an arranger for steel bands. I don't know how much of that skill is left here.
Yeah.
Two of the men I know in that field have gotten old. There are young ones, but you need more. And you're saying you're putting steel band in the schools, but
Yeah.
you need to do more to make sure the human
Certainly.
resources.
I think you raise a very important point, and it struck me that is an entire program that I'd like to sort of, I mean, the question of the arts and the question of the revitalization of the arts. I mean, the arts in its true sense is something that I think that also should inform a kind of educational vision. I'm mindful of the time, and you can see there are two big elephants in the room, which have been, and perhaps just to give a thought or two, which have been sort of bubbling up. So, I often think the question of ExxonMobil and its relationship to Guyana is one that, what does that partnership look like? How does that partnership work so that Guyana benefits, so that we don't undermine the investment climate that is a part of Guyana, that's foreign direct investment. I mean, I often think that we've been very fortunate. I think we don't fully appreciate sometimes how fortunate we are, in the sense that if someone pours $50 billion into this resource, we're seeing the benefits of it. We can have but we also need to hold on to our Guyanese sovereignty, and we also need to make decisions that are based in the interests of the people of Guyana. And so there needs to be an appropriate balance, a partnership, as it regards sort of the folks, the international companies that will engage Guyana. I mean, I suppose I could say from your time, this has been a challenge. I mean, we've seen in the early negotiations with the bauxite company and the movement towards a certain kind of economic policy. So this is something that weighs on folks, and it'd be good to kind of have your thought on this, and then perhaps more local. The questions that are arising around, say, the cash distribution and its impact on the kind of. So there are two things. I think the question of whether or not it's a good idea to have Guyanese share in the broad patrimony by way of this mechanism of a sort of cash grant, a universal basic income, etc. But then there's also the question of how one might implement something of that sort. Those are questions that are there. Questions have arisen certainly about the role of the National Resource Fund. Actually, it's interesting. That was originally what I hoped to kind of discuss, but then I thought it would be too technical, and maybe for the setting the scene in January of 2025, we needed a more expansive thought around the broad developmental trajectory of Guyana and how best it could. What are the ideas that could shape it so that it is optimal in the sense that you have described? So I'll let you weigh in. So
Yeah.
to the investments and the power of the investor, as opposed to the citizens, and the kind of ways in which we help to make that more equitable.
Well, first of all, let me say that in taking decisions, a government, like its population, ought to look around before they get too excited about what is facing them. I just point you to the fact that next door you have Suriname, which has our oil field, the Stabroek block, runs within a few miles of our maritime border with Suriname. Okay? So you have a field that may well run across east-west from Guyana to Suriname.
Yeah.
And they may have the same geological features. Suriname recently identified Block 58 and Block 52 as perhaps mega projects. Maybe not as large as Stabroek, I don't know, but on par with that type of resource. And yet, in Suriname, there have been problems delaying the conversion of those identified resources into an ongoing production exercise. And that has to do, one, with the peculiarities or geomorphological peculiarities. That is, the land under the water, what is happening, how the oil is stored, and so forth, and the risks that the oil companies associate with them. I'm mentioning that to say that although the discoveries have been made in broad terms in Suriname, production is still not committed on a scale that Suriname would like, and that Guyana, I think in the Guyanese discussion, expect. So none of this stuff is as cut and dried as people suggest. The second thing is that we have a framework, and I'm going to say this, and again, putting my head on a block, that that the configuration that you have today by way of the production sharing agreement was identified as long ago as 1986 by Indonesia. We adopted it in the 1980s and have refined it since. And the decision that we have arrived at today that shares the resource in the way that it is shared, it's the product of decisions by all the post 1992 governments. I would say that, okay? And that is a fact. And so everybody has to understand that. And that may also explain why there is this, why some of the commitments that people are demanding of the political parties are not made. The second thing is that you're speaking of an undertaking that is not normal. I get the impression even our distinguished accountants, when they're looking at this matter, get confused. You have a resource. That resource to be exploited needs to have, let us say, partners that have the competence and the money to undertake the exploitation. Guyana has neither the competence nor the exploitation. Guyana tried using the networking skills of one of our entrepreneurs, and that led to CGX. CGX identified potential. They started working on that. And when the drilling work was being done by CGX, it was discovered that the pressures, and I'm not an expert in this, but I understand that this is true, the pressures were so great that CGX now had to find a partner with the technical skills and the financial resources to deal with such a well. And in the course of doing that, they have, in effect, lost control of that well. Am I making sense to you? So it's not it's not a question of identifying an oil company and saying, hi, you have money, you have the skills, come and drill. Because it has to, you have to ensure that they committed their resources and skills to that. And when they run into problems, they don't abandon them. That you are not abandoned. We've had several experiences, whether it is of the drilling in the Rupununi or the drilling of the Quarantine, where oil companies started and walked away and left us. It is not an impossibility. And you may have problems with the current contract. Your first task is to ensure that that company works with you to get more out of the ground than you currently get. You as Guyana, obviously, in order for them to commit to that, they will have to see or feel that there's a prospect that they are going to get returns. Undertakings by this, where one partner provides no money and only provides the natural access, or only provides access to natural resource, is not the same as a company coming and investing in setting up a joint company with Guyana. It's not the same, and the obligations are not the same. And we speak about the PSA as though it is such an arrangement. It is an arrangement that allows, and I want to make this very clear. My understanding as an economist, I don't care what accountants say, they need to look more carefully, is that in the development phase of these wells, of this resource, the oil companies will get more than the country does, at least let us say in the first 8 years. At the end of that period, the share of the country or the share of the treasury will increase. That is what the rule says. Now, the tax regime is another matter. I don't want to take that on now, but I think it needs to be understood. The revenues going to the oil company will be like that at the beginning, relatively even and larger than yours, and eventually the treasury will be taking a larger share of that. Now, somebody will tell you, oh, by the time they get it in 8 years' time or whenever, all the oil will be gone.
The oil is
I don't
done.
want to go there. What I'm saying to you is that these are decisions. You can take them at one point in time. They may turn out to be inadequate or wrong. And you have to look at that as you go along. But we have settled into a sort of hopelessness and a hopeless aggression at times that is alarming. We are getting benefits out of the exploitation of the resource. We will get more benefits down the road. It is not the case that you can simply say, well, you know, last month Exxon got $40 billion in terms of revenues. Guyana only got 4, therefore it is unfair. You have to look at the time flow of the revenues coming from the asset. That's the only way it's going to make sense. And so, no, all I'm pointing to is the need for some patience, but also saying to you, you're asking about the citizens versus the investor. You also have a responsibility, and I'm saying this without fear of contradiction, that as a government, the government has to ensure that its revenue collecting authority has as many and as high levels of skills as possible.
Yeah.
We talk a lot. We should have taken this more from Exxon. But what is actually the law saying that you can get from Exxon? Are we sure?
Or are we optimizing what our current context is?
That is the story. I am not sure that we can say that. And so that element needs to command more attention. More resources need to be directed to the GRA, for example, and the use of all sorts of facilities and skills can help us in this regard. Now, as regards citizens, taxation is a complicated story, but it's very simple. There are many instruments by which you can get revenue from a company. You got corporation tax, you got withholding tax, many. I don't want to go through all of them, but the point is this, that you as a government have to decide early what you want.
Taxation strategy is going
right?
to be.
And what mix of tax tools will be more effective in getting the money from them, bearing in mind that when circumstances change, if you have one tax weapon, it may not work in changed circumstances. It may benefit the investor rather than you. So you have to be flexible in that regard. And people may say, well, you're not flexible enough. But I'm saying to you that there is no one simple solution. As I said, in 1986, people were finding, especially in Indonesia, for example, that corporate taxes levied on oil companies allowed the oil companies to use the complexity of the industry, the same problem of the geology or the location of the oil on the ground, and the technical process allowed them to hide uh, their revenues and allowed them to inflate expenditure. It is not true that there's a far simpler method of getting money out of these companies. All all these companies will exploit the tools that you use, whatever you use. You have to keep sharp. That's the point. You have to keep your skills
Yeah,
sharp.
I think what you're saying, all roads lead to complexity.
Absolutely.
You need a few people on your side committed to your interests who can manage that complexity.
Right.
And
And
you
you
can
need more. You need
and you need
however
more
many
people.
you need more. But the last point about the citizen, other than by getting the money by taxes, uh, is this, that the revenue that the government receives, it's up to the government to come to a compact with the citizens and the representatives of the citizens as to how that money is to be used. And cash grants are as legitimate as any other. Cash grants are as legitimate as any other. Yes, it has disadvantages. In the old days, economists used to say that it is likely to result in a withdrawal of effort. You give people cash and they go home and lie down and sleep all day. Well, I think the reality is that today, that is not believed to be true by the cognoscenti, those who make their income from looking at such things. And there are many examples, even outside of Norway, where income is made available either as negative taxes or as cash grants to members of the public on the clear understanding that this will enhance their commitment to the development goals and more efficiency. We have to understand that that is working elsewhere, and you have to pay attention to your country and its institutions to ensure that people don't, if you like, react negatively to that. It isn't only the amount of cash that you give them that will determine how they behave. The environment in which they work, how the government deals with them, the private sector as a whole, what they see happening in wealth distribution, all of that matters. It's not just whether you give them 2,000 US dollars a year or whether you give it to them a week. There are many other things, and we tend to simplify these things beyond the point where discussion can be intelligent. A lot of that discussion has passed that point, I'm afraid. I don't want to be rude, but you have to stop and think about what it is that can be really done. And I see now on the screen some
Yeah,
questions about
yeah.
time.
No, I think, and I have to say, Rennie is also an
Quite,
economist of some.
yeah. Well,
So,
this is a point is quite right.
but I think that's, I feel like this is one of the reasons. I think this is what is missing, and it's so refreshing to talk to you always. I think that in a we've not been able to have intelligent, informed decisions with experts to say, here are a set of policy choices. Among the set of policy choices, here are the ones that we think work for us politically. Here are the ones that we think work for us socially, and so on. And so maybe in a sense, someone has been saying, we'll have to, I don't know how this works, but we'll have to have you come back and do another one of these hours, because I'm noting here that it's so it says 8:45 on my time, so 8 and 3, so it's 11:45 Eastern time. We've gone past what you promised at
Right.
11:30. Uh, but as you can see, when you're having a proper conversation, sometimes the time slips away.
And
And
more
I'm very,
questions,
very,
more questions and comments are emerging from the audience.
yeah. So I maybe seek your indulgence in two things. So this question of the question of the the way in which the Natural Resource Fund works, Natural Resource Fund 2019, its refinement or change, Natural Resource 2021 has been a source of issues. I mean, I have read both of these, and they, as documents, they seem to be, you know, in a way, aspects that complement each other, and they're not as contentious as, you know, some aspects
Yeah.
are not as contentious as appear in the media. But I think, you know, I'd like to hear you reflect on that, and just given the time that we're, so the last question I had for you is, you know, just to take a few minutes to kind of, you know, look forward to a 2040. I gave you a far date out so that you could you could cast your mind out given the experience that you've had. Uh, you know, so reflect for us on the business of the Natural Resource Fund, its sort of broad role, and, you know, any kind of technical details that you think ought to be, and then take a step back and give us a sense of, at the beginning of 2025, the start of the end of the first quarter of this century, as a Guyanese of distinction who has served the nation in perhaps its most challenging period in the development of the economic recovery plan. You know, seeing the largesse that we sit with today, and the battles that we're fighting, you know, where do you see us sort of down the road? And we'll close there.
Thank you. Thanks ever so much again for your tolerance, Terence. The Natural Resource Fund is a mechanism that perhaps many people might relate to in another context in the biblical times, a recognition that, you know, you can move very easily from famine to feast and back. Just as when harvests are very higher than expected, it is prudent to ensure that you have storage. I'm not well enough versed in the Bible anymore to be able to identify for you um, the examples of that. But we are in a sort of a phase like that. Uh, the international the international market is such that it remains a risk. We've spoken about diversifying, but to the extent that you are here now in 2025 and you are reaping revenues, you need to avoid a situation in which you spend and then at the end of the year or in the middle of next year, you suddenly find you don't have money and you have to do what our neighbors would do from time to time in the 1970s and 80s. You suddenly cut all investment, you cut salaries, and you stop spending. So the idea is that you put aside a significant proportion of the monies collected. You give yourself a year. That is what this formula, our formula, is using. Give yourself a year to see what that money put aside is, and then you decide in the following year to spend up to a ceiling of that old money. Because we do find ourselves in a situation where things are needed as of day before yesterday. And so you can't sit forever waiting. There's been a reference to the time value of money. So that is important. But I think what is clear is that the formula uses an arbitrary one. And the danger or the fear of many people is that notwithstanding the formula, governments will or have been finding a ways to get around that, whether it is by borrowing or whatever else, to spend more than has been collected, right? And then leave us in the doo-doo, as they would say. In a sense, this depends on trust. You have, and common sense, you have to say, well, just how urgent are the expenditures that you have? It becomes very, very difficult. It becomes very, very difficult to persuade the public or even members on your board that you are using the right formula if they are seeing expenditure which they regard as inappropriate or unnecessary or excessive. And so a lot of this has to do with balance. A lot of this has to do with balance. I'm not going to argue that, well, the formula should be that you can't spend more than 40% of what you collected in the previous year this year. Lower ceilings may be effective, but like a problem we were discussing earlier, men are always going to find ways around that. The thing is to ensure that what you use it for is absolutely necessary and that you don't waste it. That to me is going to reduce a lot of the complaints and argument over whether the natural resource fund is what it should be and the formula is adequate. That has to be done. People have to be satisfied. And in order for them to be satisfied, there has to be more involvement. There has to be involvement. Not everybody you want to send on the board, send to the board. But the members have to be satisfied that they have a role and they're not just rubber stamps. One of the complaints you will see is just of rubber stamping. Well, it's the government's responsibility to ensure that its boards on all fronts are satisfied that they're contributing to something. If they're not contributing and it's their fault, change your board. If they're not contributing and you can see, as the public is saying, well, it's your fault, pay attention to the process that you have, so that people who are working in public interest can be satisfied that their energy and effort is worth the while. I don't want to get more specific than that.
No, I think you've synthesized it perfectly. I think I think the biblical allusion kind of gets it to just about right. And it's a question of, can we collectively kind of get the right level of trust in that process, and so that people understand that, the funds are really being saved for a rainy day and they're not being spent at the capricious whims of whoever decides. And I think that, and what is interesting, I mean, it's a political question. I want to take one more because I actually spent the time, there's this question, there's a political question here around, well, was the 2019 NRF better than the 2021 NRF? And I think if you just simply read the documents and you analyze the question that you just raised around, how do you ensure a diversity of the board? Certainly in the 2019 document, there's a much larger cross-section of representation on that board. In the 2019 document, certainly one sees that the question the question of the macroeconomic policy, the question of the fiscal policy groups, then making recommendations to the Minister of Finance. But also there is a logic to the kind of simplicity of the, I used in quotes, simplicity of 2021, which says, look, here we're in this kind of rapid developmental mode, and we want to, we'll spend 90% of what we have today, and then 75%, and then 50%, and so there's a sliding scale down. But it gives me a certain flexibility today to respond to all of the chaotic things that emerges. But again, what one would hope emerges from this is that, our policy people would sit down and say, there are some really good things in 2019, and there's some really good things in 2021, and let's make a 2025 or a 2026 that kind of refines both 2021 and 20 in the interest of the people of Guyana. So, but as you can see, these questions really require.
And they'll continue to arise, and they are legitimate questions. I agree with the contradistinction you're making in terms of the two structures of decision making. But again, as I say, people will always find, those in a position to do so will always find ways to get around whatever target you set yourself. I just remind you of the fiasco with NIS resources prior to 2015, and even the difficulty of locating where some of them have ended up. The point is that, yes, if one person or two persons are making all the decisions, it is simpler, but it also exposes you to the risk that they may be wrong. They may take an inappropriate decision, and you will find yourself unable to retrieve or recoup your situation. So you need to have safeguards, whatever system you have. In other words, if you have a board and a board is as large as 15 or 20 people and it's not doing what it's supposed to do, you put in a safeguard that says decisions have to be taken within a certain time. Discussions are not to be informed by violent debate in the boardroom. People must do their work before. You may have them bring you suggestions or even papers, short, brief papers, to the board meeting. The board discusses those rather than waiting. In Guyana, people don't do that. They turn up to the meeting. Very often, they start reading the document in the meeting, or they wait for somebody else to explain what they understand by the document. It is a mortifying experience. So it is true that you have to be careful about the membership of boards, but you have to have rules. You put in place rules that will minimize these dangers. One person taking all the decisions on behalf of others, other people just turning up and being passengers. All of these things can be seen in many, many, many of our boards. The government and its advisors have to devote their attention to reducing those things. They have to pay attention to that because that's the reality. As some of the Europeans say, the danger is in the details. Yes, you can all agree to have a fund. It's not having the fund that is now the problem. You have the fund. But what are the details governing the management of the fund? How decisions are made by the fund? How the people are selected? And when they're selected, how you keep them constrained to work in the national interest? Is a lot of questions.
Yeah.
But it's
well, I'm glad that you are playing a role somewhere in this process.
Yes, but on the other one that you mentioned about
so the division thing, where do you see it going?
The strategic risks we face, you have to recognize that if you don't effectively and quickly spend that money, it may serve as a honeypot, an attraction to others to come and try and seize it. So it is in our interest to do what we have to do effectively and expeditiously, both effectively and expeditiously, if you are to help yourself in relation to the strategic challenges we face from neighbors.
And so I give you the last thought on the 2040. What's
Yes. On the 2040, it may sound as though it's a long distance away, and I believe governments often operate on that basis. We can do what we want now, and in 4 or 5 years' time, we will fix. But the reality is that things don't work that way. If you want the economy to be working in a certain way by 2040, some of those mechanisms have to be put in place now. And the decisions that will inform how you get there have to be made now. So we have to try, the government has to try, the government and its counterparts in the parliament have to try to ensure that they look at these things. Maybe they can give thought to some of the, more careful thought to some of the suggestions being made by the audience and others, and have some small teams reflect on these things so that within a year or two, they will choose from amongst them formulae, rules for the boards, and so forth. By the time you get to 2040, this will not be the subject of discussion at all. Those rules will be in place, and the public will not be wondering whether they will live to see the real benefit of the resources flow to themselves and their children. It's up to us. We have to do it.
Yeah.
So that's my word. You have to You have to think
Well, I
about.
think as I'm always, I feel a bit inspired, so I'll go say something interesting.
Okay,
Uh, you know, VP, Foreign Secretary, Foreign Minister,
just Carl is all right.
international public servant, internationally recognized. You know, I don't know. I don't know if you noted. You're listed in Marquis Who's Who as a
Yes,
noteworthy international public servant. So, I think you're, as you know, Guyanese of genuine distinction, and we have been really grateful for your visit with us today, and certainly the audience has been quite active. You know,
yes.
it's been a really robust discussion, and I hope that it can catalyze many other discussions of this type. Uh, I think I come away from this with the biblical sense of, and maybe this is the sense perhaps in which we ought to think about this, and in the sense in which our grandparents and others uh, would have us think about this, that we've been bestowed a bit of a bounty, and it has come to us, and we must not, like we must be wise in making preparations and saving some for a rainy day, which will come. And I think this is the second point I want to emphasize on closing, is that, as you've just noted, often when you think about your vision for 2040, well, your vision for 2040 is today. 2040 is determined by the decision that the Ministry of Finance will take today, that the Ministry of Labor will take today, that the private sector will take today, that the folks who are part of the School of Agriculture or the university, the decisions we take today, I think, are the decisions that will inform the lives of our children and grandchildren in 2040 in Guyana and in the region and in the wider world. So I want to thank you for this sharing today, and it's been very deeply appreciated, and also to thank the audience for joining in. It's been, I think this has been the highest one. So obviously you're doing something. The people obviously
I'm
we're
talking
just
too
in,
much.
hearing you speak.
Speaking
So
of the audience, maybe I can say this, Terence, that I'd be happy to look at some of the comments more carefully that they have sent, with a view uh, in the future somehow perhaps to address some of the things that are being raised, if not in a note, then in some other way, so that they don't feel that if the specific query or comment wasn't addressed, that is lost. Because I myself would like to look at them in a more timely fashion.
thank you. I will endeavor to gather them up and share them uh, with the appropriate parties.
Thanks ever so much.
Thank you. Colleagues, have a wonderful day. I head to the Seattle Convention Center now.
Good luck in that regard on the journey and the outcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, all the best
Bye.
for 2025 too.
All the very best to, yes. That was excellent.